The Ethiopian Bible says Jesus is not what you were taught, not two natures stitched together, coexisting side by side. One, fused, made one, in the exact language the Geshe's manuscripts use, a word the Western Church spent centuries trying to erase. In 451 CE, a council convened, a vote was taken, and one description of Christ was declared orthodox, while another was declared heresy. Not because the evidence favored one side, but because the emperor did. What survived that vote in Rome is not what survived it in Ethiopia, and the version they buried describes something far stranger than fully God, fully man. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church does not read the same Bible most Western Christians grew up with. Its canon holds 81 books, not 66. Texts like Enoch and Jubilees, quietly dropped from the Western table centuries ago, still sit inside its Old Testament as scripture, never questioned, never removed. That alone tells you something about how this church operates. It did not simply inherit Christianity from Rome and trim it down. It preserved a version that split off. Before most of the West's editorial decisions were even made, the language matters as much as the content. Ge'ez, the old liturgical language of the Ethiopian highlands, is not a dead academic curiosity. It is still chanted, still copied, still guarded inside monasteries that have held the same manuscripts for over 1,000 years. When scholars want to know what early Christianity looked like before Constantinople and Rome finished shaping it into the form most people recognize today, Ge'ez texts are one of the few places that record shows an answer no one edited for later audiences. That isolation was not an accident. Ethiopia sat outside the reach of the Byzantine and Roman churches by the mid-400s, connected to the wider Christian world by trade routes and occasional envoys, but never folded into its councils, never bound by its votes. Whatever got decided in the great imperial cities happened without an Ethiopian bishop in the room casting a vote that mattered. And in the 5th century, one specific decision was made in exactly that setting, a decision the Ethiopian church would spend the next 1,600 years quietly refusing to accept. This is where the word Tewahedo enters the picture, and it is worth pausing on it, because most people who have heard the name of this church have never been told what the word actually claims. Tewahedo is not a denomination label the way Baptist or Lutheran describes an organizational branch. It is a theological assertion built directly into the church's name. It means, roughly, made one, or unified. Not united in fellowship, not united in doctrine loosely defined, united in nature. The claim sitting inside that single word is a claim about what Jesus Christ actually is, at the level of his being, not his biography. Western Christianity, almost without exception, teaches that Christ possesses two natures, fully divine and fully human, existing together, distinct, unconfused, joined but never merged. That formula is so deeply embedded in mainstream teaching that most churchgoers assume it is simply what Christianity has always said, self-evidently, without controversy. It is not. It was a specific formula, worded a specific way, adopted at a specific gathering, at a specific moment when disagreement inside the church had already hardened into open division. The Ethiopian church was there for the build-up to that gathering. It was not there for the vote. And the answer it kept instead was not a variation on the two natures formula. It was something else. The Ethiopian tradition holds that Christ's divine and human natures did not remain two things existing side by side after the incarnation. It holds that they became one, fused into a single unified nature, the way two things can combine into something that is no longer describable as two things wearing one label, not a hybrid, not a compromise. One nature, formed out of the union of two, in a manner the tradition describes as complete and total, rather than partial or symbolic. To understand why the Ethiopian church ended up defending that description, while most of Christianity ended up defending the opposite one, you have to go back to the years just before the split became permanent, when the argument over Christ's nature stopped being a theological debate contained in monasteries and started being settled by councils, politics, and the will of an emperor who wanted the disagreement over. The argument that would eventually split the church in two did not begin as a fight over which side was right. It began as a fight over which bishop had authority, and it started at the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE. Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, had been teaching a version of Christ's identity that spoke of the divine and human as so distinct they nearly functioned as two separate persons sharing one body. The council condemned that view outright, and for a moment, the Alexandrian position, defended by Cyril of Alexandria, looked like the clear winner. Christ was one, not two persons loosely cooperating. That victory did not last 20 years. Cyril died. His successor in Alexandria, Dioscorus, inherited both his theological position and his enemies. And in 449, at a second council in Ephesus, Dioscorus pushed the Alexandrian position further than Cyril ever had, condemning bishops who disagreed and consolidating Alexandria's authority over how Christ's nature would be defined for the entire church. Rome was furious. Pope Leo's own theological statement on the matter had been read aloud and rejected outright at that same council. He would later call it, pointedly, a den of robbers rather than a legitimate synod. 2 years later, the political tide turned completely. A new emperor, Marcian, needed the Western Church's support and had no patience for Alexandria's growing dominance. In 451, he convened a new council at Chalcedon, and this time the outcome was reversed by design. Dioscorus was condemned, exiled, and stripped of his office before the theological debate had even meaningfully concluded. The council then adopted a formula stating that Christ existed in two natures, divine and human, joined but never merged, distinct but never separated. That formula became the fixed orthodox position for the majority of the Christian world, and it remains the position recited in most Western creeds today. What gets left out of that summary, almost every time it is told, is how much of the outcome depended on who held political leverage in 451, rather than which reading of Scripture was more defensible. Dioscorus was removed from the proceedings before the vote that condemned his position was finalized. Entire delegations aligned with Alexandria either walked out or were sidelined. The council's result was not a theological consensus arrived at freely. It was a formula backed by imperial authority, enforced afterward with the machinery of the state behind it. Not every church accepted the outcome. The Ethiopian tradition, following Alexandria's older position, along with several other ancient churches connected to that same lineage, refused to sign on to Chalcedon's two natures formula. Ethiopian theological literature, most notably the Haymanot Abba, the Faith of the Fathers, a compiled collection of patristic writings central to Ethiopian doctrine, preserves the pre-Chalcedonian position as the authoritative one, treating the 451 formula not as a correction, but as a departure. What that older position actually claimed about Christ's nature, in precise terms, is the part almost no Western sermon ever explains. The term at the center of the Ethiopian position is Maya Physis, from the Greek Maya Physis, one nature. It is easy to hear that phrase and assume it collapses Christ's divinity and humanity into a blur, one thing swallowing the other until neither remains distinguishable. That is not what the term claims, and the distinction matters enormously to the tradition that has defended it for over 1,500 years. Miaphysite Christology holds that in the Incarnation, the divine and human natures of Christ united into a single nature, without confusion and without separation. Both properties remain real and intact within that union. Divinity is not diminished. Humanity is not absorbed or erased. But the result is not two natures existing in parallel, cooperating the way two partners share a task, while remaining two people. The result is one nature, formed completely out of the joining of two, the way the tradition frames it. Not a mixture that dilutes, but a union that completes. This is the specific point where Ethiopian theology and the Chalcedonian formula genuinely diverge, and it is not a minor wording difference. Chalcedon describes two natures existing, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. A formula carefully built to preserve the number two. The Miaphysite position, preserved in Ethiopia and rooted in Cyril of Alexandria's writings, insists that description still concedes too much distance between the human and the divine. that a Christ described as two natures side by side is a Christ whose union is incomplete, contingent, almost provisional. The primary textual anchor for this position inside the Ethiopian tradition is a body of writings known as the Kyrillos collection, a compiled body of Cyril of Alexandria's Christological texts translated into Ge'ez and treated as core doctrinal material, not peripheral commentary. Scholars working on Ethiopian Christian literature, including researchers cataloging the Ge'ez manuscript tradition at institutions such as Hamburg's long-running Ethiopian Studies program, have documented how central the Kyrillos material remains to Ethiopian theological education, even now, taught as foundational doctrine rather than historical artifact. Inside that collection, the Ge'ez tradition preserves Cyril's own formula almost as a slogan: one nature of God the Word, incarnate. Not one nature that used to be two and got averaged out. One nature because the joining itself was total. The human was not standing next to the divine. The human was taken up into the divine so completely that the resulting reality could no longer be accurately described using the language of two. That is the claim sitting underneath the word tewahedo, made one, and it is worth sitting with the weight of it for a moment. It is not a claim about labels or church administration. It is a claim about what happened in the tradition's own terms at the exact moment divinity entered a human body, not a partnership, a fusion, complete and irreversible. The obvious question, the one that determines whether this is a marginal Ethiopian peculiarity or something bigger, is whether any other church arrived at the same conclusion independently, without borrowing the position from Ethiopia, and without any coordination across geography or language. The answer to that question is what turns this from a single suppressed manuscript tradition into something considerably harder to dismiss. 3 other ancient churches rejected Chalcedon, and none of them did so by copying Ethiopia's homework. Each arrived independently, working in its own language, from its own manuscript tradition, at the same conclusion the Ge'ez texts preserve. Together with Ethiopia, they form what scholars now group under a single umbrella, the Oriental Orthodox Communion, a family of churches united by the one thing Chalcedon asked them to abandon and all 4 refused to give up. Start with Egypt, since this is where the position originated before it ever reached Ethiopia. The Coptic Orthodox Church, tracing its lineage directly through Alexandria and Cyril himself, rejected Chalcedon's formula in 451 and has never reversed that position. Egyptian Christians paid for that refusal for centuries, treated by Byzantine authorities as schismatics, occasionally persecuted for it outright. The Coptic liturgy still recites Cyril's one-nature formula as a living confession, not a historical footnote, every time it is spoken. Move to Syria, and the pattern repeats with almost no variation. The Syriac Orthodox Church, sometimes called Jacobite after the theologian Jacob Baradius, who helped preserve it under Byzantine hostility in the 6th century, holds the identical Miaphysite position, expressed in its own Syriac theological vocabulary rather than Ge'ez or Greek. Jacob Baradius spent decades secretly ordaining bishops and priests to keep the tradition alive while the empire actively tried to stamp it out. Traveling in disguise across a region where holding this Christological position could cost a churchman his position, his freedom, or his life. Then Armenia, geographically isolated from both Egypt and Ethiopia, with no direct textual dependency on either. The Armenian Apostolic Church rejected Chalcedon at its own regional council in 506, codifying the Miaphysite position as national doctrine for a kingdom that would go on to face centuries of pressure from Byzantine, Persian, and later Ottoman powers to conform. It never did. Armenian Christology to this day describes Christ in the same few singular terms the Ge'ez manuscripts use: 4 traditions, 4 languages, 4 geographically separated regions with limited direct contact across much of their history, and all 4 independently preserved a description of Christ that a single imperial council tried to erase in a single afternoon in 451. Modern scholars of Oriental Orthodox Christianity, including researchers who specialize in comparative Christology across these communions, have increasingly argued that the historic monophysite label applied to these churches by their critics was itself a distortion, that the actual shared position across Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and Ethiopia was never the crude fusion into erasure that opponents accuse them of, but the more careful Miaphysite formula this section has already laid out. So here is the answer, stated as plainly as the tradition itself states it. The Ethiopian Bible, and the three other ancient churches that refuse Chalcedon alongside it, do not describe Jesus Christ as two natures cooperating side by side, distinct and separate, the way most Western congregations recite every week. They describe him as one nature, formed completely out of the union of divine and human, a joining so total that the result can no longer be accurately divided back into its two original components, not two things wearing one name, one thing made from two, without residue of the separation left behind. That is what Tewahedo means. That is what four independent churches were willing to be exiled, persecuted, and permanently cut off from the rest of Christendom to keep saying, uninterrupted, for over 15 centuries. What is harder to explain is why the version taught in nearly every Western pulpit today is the other one, and why that outcome had far less to do with which position better fit the evidence. The honest answer is that Chalcedon's formula won because it had an emperor behind it, and the Miaphysite position lost because the churches defending it had already been stripped of political leverage before the debate was finished. Marcion needed Rome's cooperation. Dioscorus was expendable. The theology that got canonized into orthodoxy for most of the Christian world was the theology that happened to align with whoever held power in 451, not the theology that had somehow been proven more faithful to the earlier tradition both sides claimed to be defending. None of this means the Ethiopian position is simply correct and the Chalcedonian one simply wrong. That is not a claim this video is in a position to settle, and it is worth being direct about that limit. What can be said with confidence is narrower, and it is stranger than a verdict either way. Four separate churches, working in four different languages under four different empires, with limited coordination across most of their history, preserved the same description of Christ against enormous and sustained pressure to abandon it. That kind of independent persistence is not proof of theological truth, but it is not nothing either. The Ethiopian manuscripts are still there, still copied by hand in Ge'ez the way they always were, still calling Christ made one rather than two things standing together. The word survived the council that tried to outvote it. It survived the centuries of isolation that followed. It is still sitting in the Haymanat Abba and the Cherlos collection today, unchanged, waiting for anyone willing to ask what their own church actually decided in 451 and why.